"Take that, you mare!" her husband yelled, splashing boiling water in my face when I refused to hand over my salary card with $500,000 on it. After that, my dear husband got such a surprise that he didn't see coming. But before I begin, I ask you to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and enjoy. Laura sat on the edge of the old wooden dock, dangling her legs over the water. The lake lazily lapped at the supports, reflecting the sunset sky where clouds burned crimson. In her hands, she turned a worn notebook that she'd found that morning in a dresser drawer while sorting through old things. She was 42, but in this moment she felt like the girl who once dreamed of distant countries, big stages, and freedom. The notebook was filled with her handwriting, plans, poetry drafts, wish lists. She flipped through the pages, and her heart squeezed at how much of this remained just ink on paper. Laura glanced at her phone, lying next to her on the dock. A message from her husband Stephen had come an hour ago. "Where are you?" "Dinner's getting cold." She didn't respond. She didn't want to. In recent months, their conversations had been reduced to household trivia, and each time she caught herself thinking that she talked to him like a roommate, not like someone she'd lived with for almost 15 years. She stood up, brushed the fine dust off her light pants, and walked to the car. The drive from the lake to town took half an hour, and Laura turned on the radio to drown out her thoughts. An old song about love and separation played through the speakers, and she couldn't help but smile. How cliché, but how accurate. In town, the streetlights were already lit, and the streets, familiar down to every crack in the asphalt, seemed foreign. Laura parked near a small cafe on the corner where she used to hang out in her youth. Back then, she worked at the local newspaper, writing notes about city events, and in the evenings sat here with colleagues, arguing about books and dreaming about the future. The cafe had hardly changed. The same wooden tables, checkered tablecloths, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. She ordered mint tea and opened her notebook. On one of the pages was written, "Move to Seattle, rent an apartment by the water, write a novel." Laura laughed out loud. Seattle, a novel. It sounded like an 18-year-old girl's dream, not a woman who tomorrow had to sign a contract for another project at her construction firm. The waitress, a young woman with bright leaf-shaped earrings, set the tea on the table and glanced at the notebook. "Wow, is that your journal? Cool that you write by hand. People rarely do that anymore." Laura blushed, but nodded. "Just old notes I found by accident." The girl smiled. "Maybe it's a sign? My grandmother always says that old notes are the voice of the past reminding you who you really are." Laura looked at her with surprise. The words touched something inside, like a pebble thrown into still water. She finished her tea, left a generous tip, and went out onto the street. The evening was warm, but she felt a chill. Stephen was waiting at home. His questions, his habit of silence at dinner, his way of deciding for her what was important and what wasn't. She got in the car, but instead of turning toward home, she drove in the other direction, to the old park where she once walked with her friend Natalie. The park greeted her with silence. The trees, illuminated by sparse streetlights, cast long shadows. Laura remembered how she and Natalie, still students, sat on a bench by the pond and discussed plans. Natalie dreamed of opening her own studio, sewing clothes, and Laura wanted to become a writer. Natalie had achieved her goal. Now she had a boutique downtown. But Laura, she'd become a successful manager at a construction company, but somewhere along the way lost that spark that burned in her at 20. She took out her phone and called Natalie. "Laura, where are you? It's almost midnight." Her friend's voice was, as always, lively and warm. "In the park by our pond. Remember how we used to dream here?" Natalie laughed. "Of course I do. Come over to my place. I just put the kettle on. Tell me what nostalgia has hit you." In Natalie's small apartment, it smelled of fabrics and lavender. Her friend, in a bright floral dress, bustled around, slicing cheese and arranging cookies. "So, spill it, what happened?" You don't just call at 10 p.m. for nothing. Laura sighed, looking at her cup. I found an old notebook. My plans, dreams, and I realized that none of it came true. And Stephen, he doesn't even know I once wanted to write. To him, I'm just the one who earns money and cooks dinner. Natalie frowned. Laura, seriously? You were always so vibrant. Remember how you told your stories in college? Everyone listened. And now, what? You live by his rules. Laura shrugged. Not quite by his rules, but somehow it just happened. He decides where we go on vacation, what we buy, even how I spend my salary, and I just nod. Natalie shook her head. That's not you. You were always a fighter. Maybe it's time to change something. Laura returned home, past midnight. Stephen was asleep, sprawled on the couch, the TV quietly murmuring. She looked at him. A face that once seemed so familiar now looked foreign. She went into the bedroom, took out that same notebook, and wrote on a new page, "Get myself back." It wasn't a promise, but rather a challenge. She didn't know where to start, but felt that this evening, the drive to the lake, the conversation with Natalie, even the smell of mint tea in the cafe, all of it was pushing her forward. Laura went to bed, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't dream of the usual nightmares about endless reports and deadlines. She dreamed of Seattle, a city she'd never been to, but that had beckoned her since her youth. The morning began with the usual sound of the alarm, but Laura, for the first time in a long while, was in no hurry to get up. She lay in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling of her and Stephen's apartment, thinking about last night. The notebook she'd found lay on the nightstand, as if reminding her that yesterday's determination wasn't random. Laura got up, put on a gray sweater and sand-colored pants, tied her hair in a messy bun, and went to the kitchen. Stephen had already left for work. His shoes weren't in the hallway, and on the table remained an empty coffee cup with a brown residue. She turned on the kettle and opened the window, letting in the morning coolness. The city was waking up. Somewhere a dog was barking. A car drove down the street, and the upstairs neighbor, as always, slammed the door loudly. Laura took out her phone and scrolled through her calendar. Today was an important day. At the office, they were waiting to sign a major contract with a new client, a company building a residential complex on the outskirts of town. She'd been working on this project for several months, and whether they'd sign the contract depended on her presentation. But thoughts about work were tangled with memories of the conversation with Natalie. You were always a fighter, her friend had said, and those words stuck in her head like a splinter. Laura opened the notebook and wrote, "Today, speak confidently. Don't agree to compromises." She wasn't sure what this applied to work or life in general, but she felt it was important. At the office, it was noisy. Colleagues were discussing yesterday's football game. Someone was laughing loudly at a joke, and the secretary, Linda, was running around with a stack of documents, trying to make it to the start of the meeting. Laura went into her office, small but cozy, with a view of the main square. On the desk lay a folder with the project she'd prepared for the client. She opened it, glanced at the numbers and blueprints, but her thoughts again wandered to the notebook. Why don't I write? She thought. In her youth, she composed stories that teachers praised, and one was even published in a local magazine. But then life took over: college, work, wedding. Stephen. She set aside the folder and took out that same notebook from her bag. On one of the pages was a poem written about 20 years ago. She read the first lines and smiled. Did she really write this? The words were alive, full of fire she hadn't felt in a long time. The meeting with the client went better than Laura expected. She spoke clearly, confidently, not letting herself be interrupted as her boss, Richard, often did. The client, an elderly man with thick eyebrows and a habit of tapping his pen on the table, was satisfied. "You know your business, Ms. Anderson," he said, signing the contract. Richard, who sat next to her, nodded approvingly, but Laura felt no joy. She did her job, but it was just a job, nothing more. After the meeting, Richard called her into his office. "Laura, you were great, but I wanted to discuss something else." He paused as if choosing his words. "We're opening a new division in Denver. I'd like you to head it. It's a promotion, more money, but you'll have to move." Laura was silent. Denver? It was far from everything familiar, from Natalie, from the lake where she went to think. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to start over. "I need to think about it," she said. Richard nodded. "Of course, but don't take too long. We need to decide by the end of the month." Laura left his office, feeling a heaviness in her chest. Denver was a serious decision, but was it what she wanted? Or was it just another compromise, another step in someone else's script? At home, Stephen was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a beer and watching TV. He looked up when she entered. "Well, how'd the meeting go?" "We signed," Laura replied, setting her bag on the chair. "And Richard offered me a position in Denver." Stephen raised his eyebrows. "Denver? And what did you say?" "That I'd think about it." He took a sip of beer, looking at her as if assessing. "It's a good opportunity. More money. We could buy a house there." Laura felt irritation rising. Stephen, you didn't even ask if I want to go." He shrugged. "Well, it's work. What's there to discuss?" Laura went into the bedroom, slamming the door. She took out her notebook and wrote, "I don't want to live like this anymore." The next day, Laura called Natalie and invited her to lunch. They met at the same cafe where Laura had been the night before. Natalie, in jeans and a bright yellow blouse, looked at her worriedly. "Laura, you look like you haven't slept. What's wrong?" Laura told her about Richard's offer and Stephen's reaction. Natalie listened, shaking her head. "He doesn't care what you want. He just sees you as part of his life, like furniture." "I know," Laura said. "But what do I do? Divorce? Start over at 42. Natalie took her hand. "Laura, 42 isn't the end. It's the beginning. You have savings, work, talent. You can do whatever you want." Laura looked at her, feeling tears welling up. "I'm scared." "Of course you're scared," Natalie said. "But you're stronger than you think." That evening, Laura decided to write. She opened her laptop and started typing. The words flowed as if they'd been waiting for years. She wrote about a woman who found an old notebook and decided to change her life. It was her story, but freer, brighter. She wrote until midnight, and when she finally stopped, she felt relieved. It was just the beginning, but it was a start. Stephen came home late, as usual. He glanced at her laptop, but said nothing. Laura closed it and went to bed. She didn't want to talk to him. She wanted to continue writing. A few days passed. Laura continued to write in the evenings, and the story was beginning to take shape. She decided to show it to Natalie, who read it in one sitting. "Laura, this is amazing. You have to finish it and publish it." "Publish." Laura laughed. "Who's going to read this?" "Everyone." Natalie said, "This is a story about freedom, about finding yourself. Many people need this." Laura thought, maybe Natalie was right. Maybe this was her chance. Meanwhile, Stephen became increasingly irritable. He noticed that Laura was spending less time with him, and it bothered him. One evening, he came home and saw her at her laptop again. His face darkened. "What are you always doing on that thing?" he demanded. "You spend more time with your computer than with me." "I'm writing," Laura said calmly. "Writing what?" "Some fantasy nonsense." "It's not nonsense. It's important to me." Stephen laughed bitterly. "Important? You know what's important? Money. Security. Not some childish dream." Laura closed her laptop and looked at him. "Is that all you think matters?" "It's what keeps us comfortable," he said. "Your salary, my salary, that's what's real. Not your stories." "My salary," Laura said slowly. "You mean the money I earn that you want to control?" Stephen's face reddened. "What are you talking about? We're married. What's yours is ours." "No," Laura said, standing up. "What's mine is mine. I earned it." The argument escalated. Stephen demanded that Laura give him her bank card, the one with $500,000 she'd been saving for years through overtime and difficult projects. She refused. "You're being selfish," he shouted. "After everything I've done for you." "What have you done for me?" Laura asked quietly. "You've never supported my dreams. You've never asked what I want. You just expect me to follow your plans." Stephen's anger boiled over. In a moment of rage, he grabbed the kettle from the stove, still hot from the tea Laura had made, and splashed the boiling water at her face. Laura screamed and ducked, the water hitting her shoulder and arm instead. The pain was searing, but the shock was worse. She looked at Stephen, who stood there, the kettle still in his hand, his face a mixture of anger and sudden fear. "Get out," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Get out now." "Laura, I didn't mean get out." Stephen grabbed his jacket and left. Laura locked the door behind him and collapsed on the couch, holding her burned arm. She was shaking from pain, from shock, from the realization of what her marriage had become. She called Natalie, who came immediately. Together, they went to the emergency room. The burn wasn't as bad as it could have been. 2nd degree, the doctor said. It would heal in a few weeks. But something inside Laura had changed permanently. The next morning, she called a lawyer. The divorce proceedings were swift. Stephen tried to claim half of Laura's savings, but her lawyer proved that the $500,000 was entirely her earnings, saved before and during the marriage from her own hard work. The court ruled in her favor. Stephen got nothing. Laura also pressed charges for assault. Stephen was convicted and given a restraining order. He had to stay at least 500 feet away from her at all times. With Stephen out of her life, Laura felt like she could breathe again. She declined the Denver position and instead negotiated to work from home part-time, freeing up time to write. She threw herself into her novel. Every evening after work, she would sit at her desk and write. The story grew, characters came to life, and Laura felt more alive than she had in years. One day, while researching background for her novel, Laura stumbled upon something interesting at the city archives. She'd been looking for information about the history of her town when she came across a file about a woman named Maria Williams who had lived in the 1940s. Maria's story was fascinating. She had been a social worker who created a charitable fund to help children orphaned by World War II. But in 1945, Maria had disappeared mysteriously, and the fund's money, a substantial sum, had vanished with her. Laura was intrigued. She spent more time at the archives, digging through old newspapers, letters, and documents. The more she learned about Maria, the more captivated she became. Maria Williams had been a remarkable woman, brave, compassionate, and determined. She'd fought against corruption and injustice in the town, but something had happened to her and no one knew what. Laura decided to incorporate Maria's story into her novel. She would write a fictionalized version, but based on the real events she was uncovering. As Laura researched, she discovered references to a house on Forest Street where Maria had lived. The house was still standing, though abandoned and in disrepair. Laura decided to visit it. The house was a sad sight, peeling paint, broken windows, overgrown yard. But there was something beautiful about it, too, a sense of history and stories waiting to be told. Laura got permission from the city to explore the house for her research. Inside, she found it was mostly empty, but in one of the bedrooms, she discovered a loose floorboard. Underneath was a small metal box. Her heart racing, Laura opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by Maria to someone named Victor. The letters spoke of the fund, of Maria's work, and of her fears that someone was trying to steal the money. One letter in particular caught Laura's attention. It was dated March 1945, just before Maria disappeared. "Victor, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I've hidden the documents, proving what Michael has done. The fund is safe. I've moved it where no one would think to look, in the heart of the city. The key to finding it is in our special place. Remember what I told you. Trust no one else." Laura was stunned. This wasn't just history. This was a real mystery. Who was Victor? Who was Michael? And where was the fund? She took the letters to the archives and showed them to Sarah, the head archivist, who was as excited as Laura. "This is incredible," Sarah said. "These letters could solve an 80-year-old mystery. We need to preserve these and research further." Laura agreed. She also contacted a local historian, Greg Matthews, who specialized in the town's history during World War II. Greg was thrilled to help. Together, they began piecing together the story. They discovered that Michael was Michael Crawford, a city official in the 1940s who had been in charge of overseeing charitable organizations. Victor was Victor Crawford, Michael's younger brother, who had worked with Maria on the fund. According to old newspaper reports, Victor had disappeared around the same time as Maria. Some people thought they'd run away together with the money, but the letters suggested something different, that Michael had stolen the fund and that Maria and Victor had tried to stop him. Laura was so engrossed in the mystery that she decided to make it the centerpiece of her novel. She would tell Maria's story, solve the mystery of what happened to her and the fund, and expose the truth about Michael Crawford. She wrote every day, combining the historical research with a compelling narrative. Her novel was taking shape, part mystery, part historical fiction, part tribute to a forgotten heroine. But as Laura dug deeper, strange things began to happen. First, she received an anonymous letter at her apartment. It was typed, brief, and threatening. "Stop asking questions about the Williams Fund. This is your only warning." Laura showed the letter to Natalie, who was concerned. "Laura, maybe you should stop. This sounds dangerous." "I can't stop," Laura said. "Maria deserves to have her story told." The next incident was more unsettling. Laura was leaving the archives late one evening when she noticed a man in a dark coat watching her from across the street. When she looked at him directly, he turned and walked away. It happened again a few days later. The same man, or someone who looked like him, following her as she walked to her car. Laura reported it to the police, but they said they couldn't do much without more evidence. They increased patrols in her neighborhood, but Laura still felt uneasy. Then came the photograph. One morning, Laura found an envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a photo of her taken at the house on Forest Street. She was clearly visible through one of the broken windows, searching the rooms. On the back of the photo was written, "I know what you found." Laura's hands shook as she looked at the photo. Someone had been watching her. Someone knew about the letters. Laura called Greg, the historian, and told him what was happening. He was alarmed. "Laura, I think I know what this is about," he said. "I've been doing some research on the Crawford family. Michael Crawford's grandson, Stan Crawford, is a prominent businessman in town. He's on the city council and has a lot of influence." "So," Laura asked, "so if your research proves that Michael Crawford stole the fund, it could destroy Stan's reputation. The Crawford family has built their legacy on the idea that Michael was a hero, a pillar of the community. If the truth comes out, it would be a scandal." Laura understood. "Stan is trying to scare me into stopping." "Possibly," Greg said, "or someone working for him. Be careful, Laura." Laura decided she wouldn't be intimidated. She continued her research, but she took precautions. She made copies of all the letters and documents and gave them to Sarah at the archives for safekeeping. She also started recording everything she found in a cloud storage account that only she and Natalie could access. She also reached out to a journalist friend, Marcus, who worked for a regional newspaper. She told him about Maria's story and the mystery of the fund. Marcus was interested and promised to look into it. Meanwhile, Laura continued writing her novel. She was determined to finish it and publish it, no matter what Stan Crawford or anyone else tried to do. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Laura received a call from an elderly woman named Helen Crawford. She identified herself as Stan's mother and Michael's daughter-in-law. "I'd like to meet with you," Helen said. "I have information about Maria Williams and the fund." Laura was suspicious, but curiosity won out. She agreed to meet Helen at a cafe, and she brought Natalie with her for safety. Helen was a dignified woman in her 80s, well-dressed and soft-spoken. She looked tired, as if carrying a heavy burden. "Thank you for meeting me," Helen said. "I know my son has been trying to stop your research, but I think it's time for the truth to come out." Laura leaned forward. "What truth?" Helen sighed. "My father-in-law, Michael Crawford, did steal the Williams fund. I found out years after I married into the family. He took the money and used it to start his business. Everything the Crawford family has, our wealth, our status, it all came from that stolen money." Laura was shocked. "And you've known this all along?" "Not all along," Helen said. "I found out when my husband was dying. He told me the truth, made me promise to keep it secret to protect the family. But I've lived with that guilt for 30 years. When I heard you were researching Maria Williams, I thought maybe it was time." "What about Victor?" Laura asked. "What happened to him?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Victor was a good man. He found out what Michael had done and confronted him." "Michael?" She paused. "Michael killed him, made it look like an accident. And Maria, she knew the truth. Michael killed her too, and hid her body. No one ever found it." Laura felt sick. Michael was a murderer. "Yes," Helen said quietly, "and the family has been covering it up ever since. Stan doesn't know the full truth. He thinks Michael just embezzled money. But I know, and I can't take it to my grave." Helen handed Laura a folder. "These are my husband's private papers. His confession, documents showing where the money came from, everything. Use them. Tell Maria's story. Let her finally have justice." Laura took the documents home and read through them carefully. They were explosive. Proof that Michael Crawford had not only stolen the fund, but had committed murder to cover it up. She shared everything with Greg and Sarah at the archives. They were stunned. "This changes everything," Greg said. "We need to contact the police." "And the newspaper," Sarah added. "This is a major story." Laura called Marcus, her journalist friend, and gave him the full story. He was amazed and immediately began working on an article. But Laura wanted to do more than just expose the truth. She wanted to honor Maria. She continued working on her novel, now with the full story. She wrote about Maria's courage, her compassion, her determination to help children. She wrote about how she'd been betrayed and murdered by someone she trusted. And she wrote about how the truth could take decades to emerge. But it always did eventually. Stan Crawford tried to stop the newspaper article from being published. He threatened lawsuits, called in favors, did everything he could. But Marcus and his editors stood firm. The article ran on the front page. "Town's prominent family built on murder and theft." The reaction was explosive. Stan Crawford was forced to resign from the city council. The family's businesses suffered. Some people called for criminal charges, though it was unclear what could be prosecuted after so many years. But the most important thing was that Maria Williams was finally vindicated. The city held a ceremony in her honor, naming a park after her and establishing a memorial. The charitable fund was re-established in her name, funded by donations from the community. 6 months later, Laura's novel was published. She titled it The Heart of the City, based on Maria's cryptic clue about where she'd hidden evidence. The book was a success, not just locally but regionally and then nationally. Readers were captivated by Maria's story and moved by Laura's portrayal of her courage and sacrifice. Laura went on a book tour, giving readings and interviews. She talked about Maria, about the importance of uncovering truth, and about her own journey of self-discovery. "I started researching Maria's story as background for a novel," Laura told one interviewer. "But along the way, I found myself. Just like Maria, I learned to stand up for what I believe in, even when it's dangerous or difficult." The book became a bestseller. Laura was offered a contract for 2 more novels. She quit her job at the construction company and became a full-time writer. But the money wasn't the most important thing. What mattered was that she'd found her voice, her purpose. She'd honored Maria Williams and helped bring justice, even decades late. As for the actual Williams Fund, the money Maria had hidden, it was eventually found. Using the clues in Maria's letters and Helen's documents, Greg and Sarah traced it to an old bank vault in the city's First Bank building, which was now a museum. The money, adjusted for decades of interest, amounted to over $5 million. The city decided it should be used exactly as Maria had intended, to help children in need. Laura was asked to serve on the board of the newly re-established Williams Fund. She agreed, honored to continue Maria's work. She also used a portion of her book earnings to set up a writing scholarship for young women, especially those from difficult circumstances. She named it the Maria Williams Scholarship for Courage in Writing. Laura moved to a small house by the lake where she'd once sat on the dock and rediscovered her old notebook. From her writing desk, she could see the water and the trees, and every morning when she sat down to write, she felt grateful. She stayed close to Natalie, who remained her best friend and biggest supporter. Sometimes Natalie would come over, and they'd sit on the dock like they used to, talking about dreams and plans and life. Laura dated occasionally, but wasn't in a hurry to remarry. She'd learned to be happy on her own, to find fulfillment in her work and her friendships, rather than seeking completion in another person. As for Stephen, Laura heard through mutual friends that he'd remarried quickly, another woman he could try to control. She felt sorry for her, but knew it wasn't her responsibility anymore. She'd moved on. One evening, Laura sat on her dock watching the sunset, much like she had that night when she'd found her old notebook. She took out that same notebook now and flipped to the page where she'd written, "Get myself back." Below it, she wrote, "I did." The story of Maria Williams didn't end with Laura's book. The publicity around the case led to renewed interest in other historical injustices in the town and beyond. Other researchers began investigating similar cases of corruption and cover-ups. The Williams Fund grew, helping hundreds of children every year. A statue of Maria was erected in Williams Park, showing her with a child on each side, representing her compassion and dedication. Laura wrote a second novel, this time about women's suffrage in the early 20th century. It too was based on careful historical research and real people whose stories had been forgotten. Like her first book, it was both a critical and commercial success. She became known as a writer who brought forgotten history to life, particularly the stories of brave women who'd fought for justice and change. She received awards and honors, but what she treasured most were the letters from readers telling her how her books had inspired them. One letter came from a young woman named Emma, who wrote, "Your book about Maria Williams showed me that it's never too late to stand up for what's right. I was in an abusive relationship, like you were with your husband. Reading about how you and Maria were both so brave gave me the courage to leave. Thank you for saving my life." Laura kept that letter on her desk, where she could see it while she wrote. It reminded her why she did this work, not for money or fame, but to make a difference. 5 years after finding that notebook on the dock, Laura sat in the same spot, but everything had changed. She was now a successful author with 3 published novels. She'd traveled to Seattle and other cities she'd once only dreamed about. She'd found her voice, her purpose, her joy. The burned scar on her arm had faded, but was still visible, a reminder of how far she'd come, of what she'd survived. She no longer tried to hide it. Instead, she saw it as a badge of honor, proof that she'd escaped and rebuilt her life. Laura thought about Maria Williams often. In a way, Maria had saved her. The mystery of Maria's story had given Laura something to focus on during her darkest time. And in uncovering Maria's courage, Laura had found her own. She opened her old notebook one more time and read through all the dreams she'd written down as a young woman. Many of them had come true now, though not in the way she'd imagined. She had become a writer, though the path had taken 25 years longer than planned. She'd gained freedom, though it had cost her a marriage. She'd found success, though it had required more courage than she'd known she possessed. On the last page of the notebook, Laura wrote, "To my younger self, the dreams you wrote down weren't foolish. They were prophecy. It took me decades to find the courage to pursue them, but I got there eventually. Don't give up on your dreams, even if they seem impossible, even if everyone tells you to be practical, even if you're scared. Life doesn't follow a straight path. Sometimes you have to lose yourself to find yourself. Sometimes you have to fall apart to rebuild yourself stronger. I'm 47 now, and I'm finally the person you dreamed of becoming. It's never too late. With love and pride, your future self." Laura closed the notebook and looked out at the lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds called to each other in the trees. Everything was peaceful. She thought about Helen Crawford, who'd had the courage to come forward with the truth despite the cost to her family. She thought about Sarah and Greg, who'd helped piece together Maria's story. She thought about Natalie, who'd been there through everything. She thought about all the readers who'd written to her, sharing how her books had touched their lives. Most of all, she thought about Maria Williams, a woman she'd never met but who'd changed her life. Maria had been brave in her time, fighting for what was right even knowing it might cost her everything. In the end, it had cost her everything. Her life, her reputation, her story, all buried for decades. But truth has a way of emerging. Justice might be delayed, but it's not denied forever. And courage, whether in 1945 or today, still matters. Laura picked up her phone and opened her notes app. She had an idea for her next novel. It would be about a woman in the 1920s who'd fought for the right to vote, been arrested, been forgotten by history. Laura would find her story, bring her back to life, give her the recognition she deserved. Because that's what Laura did now. She found the forgotten women, the brave ones who'd been erased from history, and she told their stories. In doing so, she honored them and inspired others. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Laura stood up from the dock. She walked back to her house, her home, her sanctuary. Tomorrow she would start researching her next book. Tomorrow she would write. But tonight, she would just be grateful. Grateful for second chances, for courage found in unlikely places, for old notebooks and new beginnings. Laura Anderson had gotten herself back, and in the process, she'd found something even more valuable. Her purpose, her voice, her truth. The END. Epilogue 10 years later, Laura Anderson was a household name. She'd published 8 novels, all of them bringing forgotten women's stories to light. The Williams Fund, which she'd helped establish, had grown into a national organization helping thousands of children across the country. Laura never remarried, but she was far from alone. She had Natalie, now her business partner, in a small publishing house they'd started together, specifically to publish women's historical fiction. She had a large circle of friends, readers, and colleagues. And she had Maria Williams, whose story continued to inspire her every day. On the 15th anniversary of Maria's memorial, Laura was asked to give a speech at the park named after her. Standing before the statue, looking at Maria's bronze face, Laura spoke. Maria Williams lived and died in obscurity. She was murdered for doing the right thing, and her story was buried for 80 years. But today we remember her, not just for what she did, but for what she represents, the countless women throughout history who fought, who sacrificed, who stood up for justice, and whose names we'll never know. Every time we read a forgotten woman's story, every time we honor an overlooked heroine, every time we tell our own stories truthfully and bravely, we honor Maria Williams. We say you mattered. Your courage mattered. Your life mattered. I found Maria's story by accident while searching for my own. In uncovering her truth, I found mine. And I hope that everyone here will remember, it's never too late to be brave. It's never too late to find yourself. It's never too late to make a difference. Thank you, Maria. Thank you for showing me the way. The crowd applauded. Children ran past the statue. playing in the park that bore Maria's name. The Williams Fund continued its work. And Laura Anderson went home to write, knowing that every word she wrote honored not just the women of the past, but all the women of the present who needed to hear that their dreams mattered, their voices mattered, their courage mattered. Dreams don't have expiration dates. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be.